Dive deeper into the outcomes of that NATO summit, we can bring in Shea, former NATO security advisor who spent many years here in the headquarters of NATO in Brussels. Shea, thank you so much for joining us. Curious to hear your view. Was this a successful NATO gathering?
I think, yes, ultimately it was. And good morning to you too. And thanks for having me on the show. It ended better than it started. Clearly, Trump was in a more friendly mood towards the alliance in the private meeting. And I suppose that's the one that really counts than in some of his public remarks. For example, he did say that the US is staying in the alliance. And somebody like Trump hearing that is not always to be taken for granted. He signed off on a communique, which may not be the most interesting thing for the media, but it's important for diplomats. The official text where the US committed itself to NATO Article 5 collective defence and called it ironclad. These were the kind of things that the Allies wanted to hear. And of course, he also showed some satisfaction, unsurprisingly, with the fact that his message on defence spending has been heeded. Mark Rutte and the other allies were at pains to point out that over the last year, Europe and Canada have spent 11% more on defence. The figure now is about an extra $250 billion over the last 2 years on military budgets. So although 5 allies out of the 32 today are on that 5% target, so there's still a long way to go. Allies have until 2035, but all of them practically, with a few laggards, are moving in the right direction. So the summit was designed, of course, to be a Trump-pleasing summit by showing that the responsibility for NATO is moving both financially and militarily onto Europe. So I think, yes, people were expecting a rough ride with Trump. You always get that. But as they said about Wagner's music, it's better than it sounds. And I think it ended up on a more positive note than people had feared when Trump first arrived in Ankara.
And as you say, months of work, of course, goes into organising these summits. So as you say, officials are happy for now. But of course, Trump was very critical of allies like Spain and the UK. Is this really the end of NATO, do you think, as we know it?
No, I don't believe so. But, whether Trump doesn't like NATO or does, the messaging changes. I think, if you look at the trend line, it's been pretty clear now and for a decade or so already, which is that the United States is going to stay in NATO, which is good, but it's going to do a lot less in terms of holding up the collective defence than allies were used to during the Cold War. For example, just at the NATO defence ministers meeting a couple of days before the Ankara summit, the US Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, announced a number of significant reductions in US contributions to the NATO full structure. Only 1 aircraft carrier now instead of 2, 1 strategic bomber instead of 2, far fewer drones, far fewer fighter aircraft. And Europe has had to scramble to sort of find in its own arsenals those capabilities to replace the US. We have the spectre of 5,000 US troops leaving Germany. Some of them may go to Poland, but it's not certain. I mean, the good news is that the United States continues to uphold nuclear deterrence for Europe. That's important, and stays in the NATO command structure. But everybody now is talking about NATO 3.0, whereby they mean a NATO which is going to be run, financed, resourced, operated, Europeans in the front line, much more a European show and less an American show than the NATO we've all been used to from our fathers and grandfathers.
And just on Iran, though, we saw, of course, the war flare up in the last couple of days. Trump says the ceasefire is over. Where do we go from here, Shea?
Well, I think we need to wait and see, because clearly the talks with Iran have not yet been broken off, even if they're not going anywhere fast. I think, Trump knows from opinion polling in the United States and even the Senate passing the War Powers resolution that this war is not popular at home, even with his own Republican MAGA base. The Americans want him to end the war, and he's got the midterm elections coming up. So, I don't think he voluntarily wants to get back into a full-scale war against Iran. For Europe, of course, it's very bad news, because if Trump, on the one hand, wants Europe to spend all of this extra money on defence, the last thing you want to do is tank the European economies with higher oil prices and inflation and higher debt costs, which are going to make it so much more difficult to fund defence. And, Europe was sort of hoping for a breathing space with the oil price going down to $60 a barrel. It's now up 5%. Who knows where it's going to go. And therefore, all of the kind of pressures that we had a couple of months ago, including, of course, things like, fertilizer not getting out of the Gulf to feed hungry people in Africa. All of those difficult scenarios are going to return. But let's wait and see, because I think it's Trump's interest to keep this memorandum of understanding going and talks with Iran going. And therefore, both sides may choose after, a flurry of activity to de-escalate once more.
OK, Jamie Shea, always a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you so much for joining us live this morning.